Good morning, and welcome to ArtSpeaks 2021. Today, the ArtSpeaks series begins its 26th season. In spite of all the challenges this year has brought, we're delighted to bring you this series virtually. My name is Glenn Tomlinson, and I'm the William Randolph Hearst Curator of Education at the Norton Museum of Art. And I want to thank you not only for being here today, but also for supporting the Norton Museum with your membership and for supporting our education programs for children and youth by joining ArtSpeaks. This year's virtual ArtSpeaks talks will be available to ArtSpeaks members via login for 7 days following the live lecture. Late next spring, we will release the entire series on our online platform, Norton from Home. If you have member friends who might wish to join the program, they still may by registering online at norton.org. We will have a short Q&A at the end of today's program. If you have questions during the course of the talk, please type them into the chat box, which opens on the right side of your screen, and we'll address them at the conclusion of the program. It's a real honor for me to introduce today's speaker. An internationally recognized authority on Francisco Goya y Lucientes, Janis Tomlinson is the author of books on the artist, including Goya in the Twilight of Enlightenment and Francisco Goya y Lucientes, published by Phaidon in 1994 and reprinted in 1999. El Greco to Goya, Painting in Spain, 1561 to 1828, and the exhibition catalog Goya, Order and Disorder for the Boston Museum of Fine Arts in 2014-15. Her recent biography, Goya, A Portrait of the Artist, published this fall by Princeton University Press, has been described as the definitive biography in English about the artist, and it's the basis of her talk today. And while we cannot offer our customary book signings, the museum store does have several copies for sale online or in the shop in person. Dr. Tomlinson has lectured widely in the United States, Europe, and Latin America, and she has contributed catalog essays to exhibitions in Spain, France, Mexico. She was the United States curator for the exhibition Goya, Images of Women, which opened at the Prado in 2001 and the National Gallery of Art in Washington in 2002. A member of the Comité Científico of the Fundación Goya en Aragon, her awards include fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation and the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Dr. Tomlinson received her BA from McGill University in Montreal and her MA and PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. She's taught at Columbia University, and she was the Sterling and Francine Clark Professor at Williams College. She was also the Director of Exhibitions and Cultural Programs at the National Academy of Sciences from 1999 to 2003, and subsequently Director of Museums at the University of Delaware. On a more personal note, it gives me great joy to introduce you to my sister, Dr. Janis Tomlinson. Janis, welcome.
Thank you very much, Glenn, and thank you for having me, and I thank the Norton for sponsoring this talk. It's always a great pleasure, and I only regret that this couldn't be in person because I love to visit the museum, and I have yet to see the museum, the new museum. Today I'll be talking about a book which is a biography, which was for me a departure in my writing. Could I have next slide, please? I am by training an art historian, and like many art historians, when I write a book, I begin with the images, and I look at the images, and then I might bring in the artist's life in how to discuss how it impacts the images. A biography is a very different way of thinking, way of looking at the artist, because I didn't begin with the images, but rather I began with the documents and what we can know about Goya's life. At the outset, this was kind of a personal quest, because having written extensively on the artist's work, his numerous paintings, drawings, and etchings, I began to ask, well, who was he? Looking at portraits of someone that, writers had long said this was a great friend of Goya, I said, well, how do we know that? And of course, for me, the intersection of art and history has always fascinated me from graduate school on. And Goya lived in a fascinating period. I want to remind everyone, he was almost an exact contemporary of Thomas Jefferson. And born the same year, Goya outlived Thomas Jefferson by 2 years. So he lived during that fascinating period of European and American history, the revolutionary period, the transformational period. And as an artist who worked at the court of Spain, he was had to be very much aware of the changing politics in his nation. So when you go to the publisher and say, I want to write a biography of an artist, the first thing they'll say is, well, does he have an interesting life? Some artists do, others don't. And Goya, yes, he does. And we are so lucky that we can know so much about it. We have documents, I'm going to look at them briefly, but documents that document his career at court. We have a lot of personal correspondence from Goya to a hometown friend, Martin Zapater. We have Goya, a sketchbook that I'll be looking at. And we have a lot of, Goya's a very well-known individual. So we have a lot of documentation of people writing about Goya. We have some reviews of his works. So all this comes together in creating a picture of who the artist was. So the other question the publisher would ask before they consider it is, well, what are the other biographies and is there anything new to say? Indeed, the most recent biography, there's never been a biography. There have been many books about Goya. Robert Hughes is always cited. But again, Hughes is a book that concentrates on the work. And I want to, if you are not familiar with Goya, I think Robert Hughes' books is a wonderful point of departure for beginning to learn about the artist. But other than that, the only biographies were, one was written in 1992, was published in Paris, translated into Spanish, and never appeared in English. But even if we spoke Spanish and French, there's more new information. Next slide, please. One of the wonderful discoveries that was discovered in the mid-1980s, but not published until the early 90s, was what we call the Italian Sketchbook. Goya, as a young artist in a Spanish town of Saragossa, the capital of the province of Aragon, had tried twice to compete. He had competed twice in competitions sponsored by the Royal Academy of Madrid. He was in his late teens and 20 years old when he did this twice. He didn't get any mention. He didn't get any acknowledgement. You know, we have no sign of the works. They've long been lost. So rather than wait for approval from the Royal Academy of Madrid, he took himself to Italy at the age of 23. And what was discovered and published in the early 1990s was a sketchbook, which appears to be, it's probably the last of several that he kept during the 2 years he was there. And I show you here a page which is generally interpreted as a drawing effort or a sculpture, personally of a Roman deity. But there are many other things in this sketchbook beyond sketches. Next slide, please. For example, and this tells us that he used this book late in his time in Italy and then returned to Spain with it. On 2 pages, one of which I show here, he listed his children. So those of you who read Spanish might read the top, Nació Antonio Juan Ramón, that is Antonio Juan Ramón y Carlos was born on 29th of August in 1774. And that's the first of 6 children he lists there. All of the children listed in this would not survive past their earliest years. And this is the first mention we knew of this child. Before, we thought he had 6 children. In fact, he had 7, 6 of whom died, very possibly, I suggest in the book, because of an epidemic of smallpox that struck Spain in the early 1780s. Next page, please. Sorry, next slide, please. And the other thing that is just fascinating in this book, and that all historians want their artists to do, is that he lists on the side the cities, several cities, But then on the top of the list on the right-hand corner, he tops that list with the title, "But the best are, pero los mejores son," and then he lists those. So the cities listed on the left of this page, Genoa, Civitavecchia, Roma, are clearly those that he visited. And then he said, "But the best are Rome, Venice, Bologna." And then at the bottom, he writes, "But cities that I've only seen from a distance, from the outside." And this shows us, although it's difficult, there are many different itineraries he might have taken to cover this territory. This shows us the great amount of territory that he covered in Rome, and when he was also studying drawing at the Academy in Rome, according to another document that came to light about 15 years ago. And next slide, please. And another document, as I mentioned, are correspondence. And what is really wonderful that we have is the correspondence that he carried on with Martin Zapater. When he was 29 years old, after Italy, he returned to his hometown of Saragossa. And 4 years later, he was called to Madrid. From that point on until Martin Zapater's death in 1803, the two men corresponded. Not all the correspondence has survived, but it has. And in this correspondence, it's very personal. Goya, confesses his fears, talks about his possible enemies at court who are keeping from getting his head. He'll talk about what he's working on, et cetera, et cetera. So this offers a unique insight into his career in Madrid from the time of his arrival until 1799, 24 years later, when he was awarded his long-awaited position of first court painter at the court of Madrid. So I'd like to look at a page of that. Next slide, please. To show you just how wonderful this correspondence is. And again, as I said, and I'm going to, the correspondence tells us about his works. The paragraph on the top of the left refers to an equestrian portrait that he is now painting of the Duke of Alba. And then he tells in the second paragraph how his brother-in-law Baeo was supposed to do it, but his health is waning, and the king told Baeo to go home and rest and gave the commission to Goya. And also charming about this is Goya's self-portrait there, supposing himself as somewhat idle. And he sits, that little caption is, "So así estoy, here I am, so am I," where he sits cross-legged, somewhat idle. And writers have interpreted the object in his right hand as various, as a pencil, as this, that. I think it might be a cigarette, because we know from one of Baeo's lectures that they did attend a bullfight together and they did take a smoking break. Next slide, please. So after we read all the documents, and as I did, I began with a chronology of the documents interspersed with history, interspersed with works. Once we get all the facts together, who is the person who emerges from those? What sustained him through his incredibly productive and long career? I think one of the central tenets, characteristics of his personality was his absolute faith in his calling as an artist. I think it is that allowed him to reject to look beyond the rejections of the Royal Academy early on in his life. His father was a gilder, his brother was a gilder, he might have been a gilder too, but no, he wanted to be an artist and to take himself to Italy, to Rome, to study, and to Italy. And we'll see this again and again. And this led him, he had challenged. There were misfortunes. I mean, the death of 6 children, and still he kept moving, he kept producing, he kept going on until, right up to his death in 1828. So absolute conviction in his calling as an artist. Next slide, please. But also in this idea of what the Spanish term is invención, invention. That is his ability to develop innovative concepts underlying his imagery. So this is the thinking of the artist even before he puts brush to canvas, even before he puts pen to paper. He has an idea, a unique idea. And it comes to the fore first in relation to this painting, which is a design for a tapestry that Goya painted shortly after his arrival in Madrid in 1776. And you can see, it shows, sort of low life types. We know this because they're sprawling on the ground and they're sitting and drinking, and they're flirting with an orange seller who somehow has wandered beyond city streets to come to these men who are sitting on the banks of the Manzanares River on the outskirts of Madrid. But in describing this, he says, this cartoon is of my invention. That was for a practical purpose because cartoons of the artist's own invention were paid at a higher rate. But in a letter later that year, he says that invention is the central and most important part of his art. And so we'll be returning to that concept towards the end of the talk. Next slide, please. The other thing, and this goes, is contrary to any romantic myth of the isolated, genius, is that Goya was extremely well liked by most of his peers. There were competitors at court who didn't like him so much, but by other members of the Royal Academy, by many of his sitters who talked warmly of him, by many artists, and certainly by many of his friends, and particularly those from his hometown of Saragossa. And this trait really enabled him to advance at court, to seek out and, for example, spend 2 hours in conversation, according to his letter to Zapatero, spend 2 hours in conversation with this man who was the Secretary of State, the Count of Floridablanca, who essentially ran the government. And here we see Goya in a very complex composition, as if the young artist is almost trying to, overdo it. Goya is presenting him with a canvas that Floridablanca looks at and looks up from looking at it. He was looking at it with the glass that is in Floridablanca's proper right hand, while there is an architect behind and the portrait of the king in the background. I also want to say that this is an odd portrait. I always like to warn people, this portrait is a shadow of what it once was. That curtain behind was originally green. Goya originally wore a russet colored jacket. Floridablanca's bright red content was probably far more nuanced with shadows and textures that have been, two things happened. The dark ground has seeped through, so those white stockings that now appear gray were actually once white. And cleaning has also abraded the surface and they lose details. So again, it's an interesting portrait, but it is not the best example of Goya's work at this time. So for that, next slide, please. Let's look at another portrait of an incredibly important aristocratic family, the Duke and Duchess of Asuna, that was painted 5 years after the portrait we just saw. And we can see how Goya's style, the other thing amazing about Goya is how quickly his style shifts as he moves at their very cluttered background. Now it's simply a tonal background against which the Duchess sits with her 4 children. The Duke, dressed in mourning because of the recent death of his father, stands behind. And this is I wish when you go to the Prado, look closely, because the muslin gown of the Duchess is painted so beautifully in delicate white layers of paint. The miniatures on her bodice, each of those buttons looks like it has a miniature painting in which Goya details. Again, that delicacy of the gauze of her skirt carries over into the dresses of her daughter. And of course, there are the children who, it seems Goya, by this time having lost 6 of his own, nevertheless still delighted in painting children. And he also bought gifts for the little child of another friend. He writes that also in his correspondence. Next slide, please. The other trait about Goya, which makes him a fascinating, there was a review of this book. It's published in the New Yorker by Peter Shadwell, and he named it. He started it out as a Goya as a model on how to live through rough times. A story for our time for sure. And he is a person who persevered despite misfortunes and tragedies. Indeed, misfortunes seem to have served as a catalyst for him to refocus on his art and find new directions. And I'm showing two examples on that. The left is a painting in the Dallas Meadows in the Meadows Museum of Art at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, which shows, according to Goya's own title, a yard with lunatics. In Goya's hometown, there was a very famous madhouse, which might have inspired his theme, although, as I discuss in the book, this is clearly not an eyewitness event, because that madhouse in Saragossa was known for its very progressive treatment of the mentally ill. But Goya let me backtrack. Goya's illness and the deafness befell him in about March of 1793. By the following January, he submitted this painting along with 11 others to his colleagues at the Royal Academy. And with them, he sent a note that I tried these paintings as a new departure, in part to take my mind off my ills and my misfortunes, but also because as uncommissioned works, they let me experiment with themes and subjects for which there's no room in commissioned works. And indeed, a madhouse would not have been a commissioned subject. And it is from this point in his career that he has kind of a double-track career. On the one hand, painting magnificent, innovative paintings such as this. On the other, painting magnificent portraits and religious paintings in his role as court painter. On the right, I'm showing you another tragedy that befell not only Goya, but all of Spain, which was the war that resulted from the Napoleonic invasion of Spain that occurred in 1808. And it certainly impacted Goya because it meant it was the end of the monarchy that he had served for I'm sorry, I should have done my math before. So, yeah, for 33 years by 1808. And during that war, Goya painted portraits. Okay, during the war, Goya's Spain was occupied by the French, and Napoleon put his brother Joseph Bonaparte on the throne of Madrid. And many artists who had served the Spanish court moved over, took a salaried position with Joseph. Goya never did, which would prove much to his advantage. But he did paint portraits, official portraits of those who supported Joseph Bonaparte, which we don't have time to. But again, that was his public career under Joseph Bonaparte. But in the silence of his own studio, and that silence I underscore because by this time he was totally deaf from after 1793, he etched scenes of war, scenes of the famine of Madrid, and eventually political satires that were published 35 years after his death and are known as the disasters of war. And I show you one of those on the right. This is a scene of the famine in Madrid. As I discuss in the book, Goya spent the war years in Madrid with the possible exception of an attempt to leave Madrid very early on in 1809. But the war would last till 1813. And so although he did not witness the battle scenes that he portrays in the disasters of war, he did witness the famine which devastated Madrid from the fall of 1811 through the spring of 1812. Madrid was a city of about 150,000, and it is suggested that the toll of that famine might have been as many as 26,000 people. And this was an era when, ambulances didn't come and sweep away the dead and the dying. They were in the streets. They were to be seen. They begged, they died in the streets of Madrid. And these etchings are among just the most moving that Goya did. And we find them sometimes reproduced in relation to op-ed pieces or things, because sadly they are still relevant today. Next slide, please. So turning back, I have jumped ahead to the war years 1808 to 1813. Now I'm going to go back to the 1790s, because what's it talk about Goya unless we talk about the Duchess of Alba? I mean, I know as a child, I remember watching a rerun of the movie starring Tony Franciosa as Goya and Ava Gardner as the Duchess of Alba, and they were just carrying on. I don't think so. Okay, the Duchess of Alba was a member of, again, like the Duchess of Asuna, one of the most important aristocratic families in Spain. Okay, and on the left we find the portrait that Goya painted of her in 1795. Possibly on the estate that that her family owned on the outskirts of Madrid. It is signed and dated by Goya to the Duchess of Alba, 1795. And there she is again in one of those wonderful muslin gowns that nobody paints whites like Goya. These are just delicately painted, layered up to give an effect of gauze and an overskirt. She wears jewelry, a coral necklace, bright gold bracelets, a bow in her hair, sash, bows on her bodice, and even her little lapdog has a bow on his hind leg. This is a woman of great stature, and this is a woman who was regarded as a great beauty. The portrait on the right that many of us know because it's in the Hispanic Society of North America in New York was painted only 2 years later. Now, what had happened to the Duchess? Well, her husband had died suddenly in 1796. There might have been some political intrigue there. He died in Seville. There might have been political reasons that he left court. The Duchess had joined him before his death. And the correspondence shows she was bereft. Her husband was he was handsome, he was intelligent, he was a great equestrian, he was an incredible person, and she lost him. And this shows her in mourning. She had gone south where he was, and she stayed in the south of Spain at the Alba estate in Sanlúcar. And it was there that Goya visited her in 1797, where he probably began the portrait. She wears no jewelry. The rings on her finger were probably a later addition. She is dressed in mourning. And if you look at her expression close up, she's posed, but to me that expression is that one of a haunted woman who has suffered a great loss. It's also interesting, the story of this portrait is it remained in Goya's studio. I don't have time to go into details, but it is very possible that the Duchess of Alba never saw it. May I have next slide, please? So, as I mentioned, Goya in 1799 got the highest position available to a painter in Spain, and it was then that he painted this magnificent portrait of the family of Carlos IV. And this was, of course, one of it was. I've always thought it is one of the great group portraits, and I was glad that the critic of New Yorker endorsed that it is calling it the great court portrait. And it shows the family of Spain at a time of great optimism. Napoleon had just come to power in France after the revolution and many years of turmoil, and the Spanish royal family was trying to create alliances with Napoleon. They saw him as someone who would restore the traditional the relationship that had existed between the Bourbon King of France, now dead, and the Bourbon monarchy of Spain. So it is a painting of optimism, of solidarity, of a joy that was not to last. May I have the next slide, please? Because when Napoleon's forces invaded 8 years later, it was not unexpected. It was, in the end, Napoleon's last move after years of failed diplomacy. He really wasn't interested in helping out the Spanish monarchy. He was interested in getting Spain to move to Portugal, to block the pathways between, and to move on to England. He was interested in conquering Europe. He went to Spain in 1808, somewhat underprepared. And then he had to pull back his forces from summer 1808. He had to retreat. But in 1808, in December, Napoleon himself comes to Madrid, bombards Madrid, restates his brother on the throne, and was now having been ashamed, was really extremely violent against the Spaniards, sending reinforcements throughout the following years. And indeed, it was with the help of the English armies that Napoleon and the Duke of Wellington, is the best known representative of those forces, he would finally be rejected. But the paintings here were painted by Goya in 1814, that is after the war, when the Spanish king was restored to power, and when he restored Goya to power as first court painter. And what they show is monumental scenes of the heroism of the uprising of the Spanish people in 1808 against the invading Spanish forces. On the left is the Spaniards, you can see, of various classes by their costumes, some dressed in working class, some just in better costumes, rising up against the Mamluk mercenaries who fought for Napoleon. And I think this is interesting because the last time Spain has experienced an invasion like this, it was the Moors coming in the 6th century. So now here he doesn't show, there are French soldiers, you see in the back right of that painting, a man in the costume of the Napoleonic army, but to foreground the Moorish fighters is to bring up this idea of, this is another invasion of Spain by people who shouldn't be here, and sort of equate them with the Moorish invaders of the 6th century. And those religious overtones carry through into the other painting that ends this series. After that uprising that is shown in the painting on the left, those who had risen up were gathered and summarily executed in 4 different sites throughout Madrid. And in the painting on the right, Goya creates a wonderfully economical, extremely powerful painting that has been emulated by Manet and also Picasso in showing, a man about to be fired. And again, the religious implications are made clear by the man who, raises his arms as if on a cross, and indeed there are stigmata in his palms. So these paintings, we never knew for a long time, but recently it is shown that they were actually painted for the King of Spain. They were once in the royal palace, which makes sense because they were moved from the palace to the Prado Museum in the early 1830s, about 20 years after they were painted. Next slide, please. Oops, I should have showed this. I'm sorry, I forgot that was there, but perhaps you can see the stigmata in the raised arms of the man being shot. Next slide, please. There's so much more I could tell, but I think there are paintings that fascinate all of us. And one of those is the so-called black paintings, of which I show perhaps the most famous because of its gruesome nature, that is known as Saturn devouring his child. Goya, first of all, looking at this painting, what I'm showing you on the left is a photo. Goya painted these paintings on the wall of a country house that he bought in 1819, 9 years before his death. He painted them on the walls, and they lingered there. They lingered there after his death in 1828. They lingered there after the sale of his house by the grandson in 1854. And in 1873, before they were going to be removed from the walls, the conservator who was going to oversee that process had them photographed. And we can see by looking at the photograph and looking at the painting, going back and forth, you can see that, there's a lot more subtlety. Look at Saturn's proper left knee that here has that blatant white highlight. And you can see that in the early photograph, it's much more modulated. There's a lot more going on in that painting that has been lost to us. It's been painted over as the painting was transferred to canvas and restored. So we always have to watch out when we're talking about these paintings as objects. We always have to watch out that we aren't talking, giving Goya credit for a very bold brushstroke, which was in fact the brushstroke of the restorer. Could I have the next slide, please? But what we can talk about for certain is, again, that concept of invention, invention, the concept of this series of paintings that is recreated in this diagram. He painted them on the walls of 2 stories of this small country house that he bought in 1819. On the lower level, you can see they're quite dark, and I think that's because on the lower level there was less light entering. It's interesting how on the second floor you have figures, you have sky showing, you have figures dueling against the open sky, you have figures floating in the sky. And so the scenes somewhat open up. So we're looking at the concept of creating this series of paintings, which you, if you entered the room, create kind of a living theater of these ghoulish, supernatural types and these weird goings on that would have been all engulfing. It was an idea that he might have gotten from his early tapestry cartoons, where he created environments of images to be woven as tapestries that then surrounded the prince and princess of Spain in their rooms. It is an idea of he brings back themes that he had also painted for the country house of the Duke and Duchess of Asuna. So in a way, it's retrospective of his career. In a way, to me, I always think of Matisse going, just liberated and painting his cutouts at the end, those glorious large cutouts, and think of this as the same way of creating an image, an environment of the images. Next slide, please. One of those images is this. And again, with the restoration, I just wanted to point out this image, had about 4 feet cut off from the right-hand side. Next slide, please. And this image I want to focus on. It's not one of the ghouls, it's a woman standing. And I focus on it because, according to someone who saw it in the 1830s, it was titled Lithography. Now, when you're writing a biography, Lithography becomes important because Lithography soon appears as Goya's companion. And to talk about that, I'm going to ask for the next slide. Lithography appears as Goya's companion once Goya moved to Bordeaux. Goya was not exiled. Goya got the permission from the king to go to France to take the waters for his ills. He continued to receive his salary. He applied to renew his leave every 6 months until he finally asked for his retirement, which he was given in 1826 with full salary. And he returned twice to Madrid, undoubtedly to see his son, who he complained never wrote. We know a lot about Bordeaux because of this man, the writer Moratin, who wrote to a friend in Madrid, a friend of both his and Goya, and in them sort of reported on Goya's, and who also says in September 1824, shortly after Goya's arrival, that La Señora, the woman, the lady and her children have arrived and are living with Goya. And that is, of course, Leocadia Weiss, who we just saw. Her presence at the Black painting suggests that their relationship might have, been active back in Madrid. They might have left Madrid because of, again, there was a liberal intervention and then a restoration of a conservative government in 1823. That might have been one reason why they both chose to leave Madrid. But another link that I'll get back to is that Goya was the tutor in art of Leocadia's Leocadio's daughter, Rosario Weiss, who would become eventually the drawing teacher to Isabel, Queen of Spain, in the late 1830s. But Goya was enormously proud of this child, and wrote to a friend in Paris saying, "Can you help her? Can you take her under your wing? Can you get her teaching?" The letter went unanswered. So Goya was not alone and suffering in Bordeaux. I'm sorry. Could I please have the next slide? But again, continually experimenting. Leocadia was interested in painting miniatures, small paintings, usually done on ivory or copper. And it was perhaps for that reason that Goya himself began experiments in miniature, of which he kind of brags in a letter to a possible patron in Paris, saying, "It's a new technique that I've never seen before. Instead of little stipples, it's brushstrokes and freer." And this is one of those miniatures. We're looking at a portrait of a young lady and an old woman, usually identified with the Spanish character of La Celestina, painted on ivory, about 2 inches by 2 inches. It's a beautiful small painting that Goya created with a new technique. First, covering the ivory in black, dropping water on it, which sort of caused spots to remove the black, then working from those spots that suggested his images, wiping out more white, which we see in the skin tones, and to give him the idea of what he would do, and then filling in with painting or scraping away surfaces. And they're just magnificent small paintings. Next slide, please. He also took lithography, which was a print technique that had been invented only in about 25 years earlier. He took it to a new level with four lithographs of the bulls of Bordeaux. Next slide, please. And even though he was near death in 1825, even though everyone had given up on him, he survived. He survived an awful illness, and he must have spent the last 2 years of his life in some degree of pain. But nevertheless, he is out and about. He is looking at the world around him. He's observing the more around him. And he painted this scene of a giant seen at the Fair of Bordeaux, that is dated to 1826, when she appeared to be only ogled by the various boys and young men who seemed to stare, let's just say, below her waistline. Boys will be boys. Next question, next slide, please. But perhaps I'll end on this. I will end on this painting because it's been in the news lately. Is it by Goya? Isn't it by Goya? It's long been known as the Milkmaid of Bordeaux. In 1808, the curator at the Prado Museum said it is not by Goya. I agree with that. I honestly think that this is a collaboration of Goya teaching the young Leocadia something about painting. And what you look at it, if we had an X-ray of this, which I don't, you'd see under this canvas there are a bunch of sketches, and you can see actually on this, if you look to the left of the painting, there is a profile of a man with a cap and a beard that is coming through the surface, through time, over which it was painted. And it's a simple character that might be the work of his student Leocadia. I think it probably is the work of his student Leocadia. So here we have Goya, late in life, ever experimenting, ever productive, ever among friends like Moratin, and with Leocadia and with her daughter. Leocadia was with him at his death. His daughter and her daughter would go on to be his actual only artistic heir. I would love to take questions. I think Glenn is going to return now to help us, if there are questions that have come in, to moderate them. Thank you. And thank you very much.
Janis, thank you so much for reintroducing this master and his work, his life, and its relationship to the times during which he lived. I am checking the comments feed, and I have a couple here. Why would it be so long before the disasters of war were published? Was the content that scandalous or subversive?
That's a very good question. For a long time, scholars said, oh, they were censored. But I don't, there's no sign that ever was the case. Goya was aware, Goya was a very practical man. Because his family was impoverished, he always looked out for his money. He invested, and he had probably lost money when he published Los Caprichos. It takes a lot of effort. It takes, I mean, the disasters of war would have been a series of about 80 etchings, depending on what Goya intended. And the idea, the production of such an edition would have been a huge undertaking. One. The other thing is, in the following the restoration of the king, or following actually the overthrow of Joseph Bonaparte, the newspapers of the day carry advertisements for prints that for sale, and they are, you know, celebratory portraits of the King of Spain, of the Spanish heroes of the war. They are satires of Napoleon. They lead me to think that the Spanish public had no interest in revisiting the grisliness which had devastated the peninsula, and for especially the villages, but also to a certain degree the cities, and especially Goya's hometown of Saragossa. It was not something that would have sold. I think Goya knew that. Besides, so it's expensive production and the lack of a market, I think, explains why those weren't published.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Another question here. What access to artworks by his predecessors, such as Velázquez, would he have had as a student?
Oh. Well, in Saragossa, he mainly studied etchings and engravings, but in Madrid, now, in Madrid, he had the royal collection at his feet. Now, the royal collection, I mean, you know, goes back to the collections of Charles V, you know, buying up Titians. It is what is the basis for the collection today in the Prado Museum. And it was much, much larger, you know, during one of the results of the Napoleonic invasion is that a lot of great paintings somehow found their way outside of Spain. You might think of, you know, the Rogue Be Venus in London's National Gallery, for example, was originally in the cabinet of the royal favorite, and it actually hung next to Goya's Naked Maha. Yes, he had, and actually, okay, so his first documented encounter was 3 years after he arrived in Spain, painting tapestry cartoons, but he also produced a series of etchings after Velázquez. So we can only imagine what it was like for him to go and you know, look at those paintings, discover them. I mean, today we click on the computer, we bring up Velázquez, we see whatever we want. Imagine going into the royal palace and seeing a Velázquez and seeing it by oil light or candle light, or, you know, the best chandelier, you know, and what you would get out of it and how much you would see. And then try drawing that and translating it into etching. I mean, it was, and he did that for several of the paintings, including Las Meninas. So to do that, one has to study Velázquez extremely closely, you know, and as after he is made court painter in the early 1790s, he, like many other court painters, has to do his duty. And so with the death of one king, Carlos III, the arrival of another king, Carlos IV, at the end of one reign, they always take a full inventory of the royal collection. So Goya, working with two other artists, was assigned the Royal Palace and also the Palace of the Zarzuela to go and count all the paintings and examine the paintings, and Goya worked on that. So yes, he knew the royal collection quite well.
We have a comment, and I think one that you might like to respond to. First of all, terrific lecture. First, never heard a lecture on Goya without reference to the Maha.
Sorry. Why did I leave that out? I'm truly sorry. I can't bring it up. When you look at it, yes, that was painted, and I have no idea. If I had talked about it, I would have put it right before the portrait of the royal family. And I would have done that because I think, because the Naked Mahat, from all documents, it appears to have been painted for the king and queen's most cherished friend and confidant, the royal favorite, Manuel Godoy. And we first hear of the Naked Mahat in 1800. An academician goes to visit the palace of this, the residence, the palatial residence of this royal favorite. And he records that there's a painting of a naked woman with bad drawing and not much good color by Goya. And that is our first mention of the Naked Mahat. And then it's not until 1808, when the French are invading and the French do an inventory of that collection, that we get the first mention of the clothed Mahat. And they're both in that inventory listed as gitan, the gypsies. And I do hope everybody knows these paintings, and I do so apologize for not including them. But also, I would have gone over time had I said this. It's good that I'm saying it during question and answer. Because then the royal favorite is overthrown. He is in exile. The paintings from his collection are dispersed. Some go to England, like the Rotby Venus, and others end up in the hands of the Inquisition. So after the restoration of the Spanish king, after Goya paints the 2nd and 3rd of May, there's the Inquisition saying, go find out who painted these lascivious paintings. And they find out it's Goya. And the interesting thing is, nothing seems to happen to Goya. Other artists get pulled before the Inquisition. Other artists lose their positions. With Goya, nothing happens. And this leads me to believe that Goya had friends in very high places. So yes, I am so sorry. I do hope you have all seen the Naked and Clothed Mahat. They are easily Googleable. My apologies for the oversight.
Oh, please, don't apologize at all. No need. Well, Janice, we just want to thank you again for joining us and leading off our series this year in such a grand way. Thank you so much, and we'll see you again.
It has been a pleasure. I wish everyone the best of holidays and stay well. Thank you, Glenn.
Thank you. And ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank all of you once again for joining us today. And after the holiday season, ArtSpeaks resumes with a talk by Christina Lane. She is the chair and associate professor in the Department of Cinematic Arts at the University of Miami, and she will discuss the subject of her recent book, Phantom Lady, Hollywood producer Joan Harrison, the forgotten woman behind Hitchcock. This talk will take place on Thursday, January 14th at 11 a.m. Just like today, you will receive the login that morning. Until then, I wish you and yours a very happy and very safe holiday season. Thank you so much for joining us, and farewell.